Hi, I'm Norah O'Donnell, and this is Person to Person. Our guest today is an expert on living longer, Dan Buettner.
If you ask the average American what the optimal formula of longevity is, they probably couldn't tell you.
Dan Buettner is an author, explorer, and is best known for his work on the Blue Zones.
So it's Saturday night in the Blue Zone in Icaria.
Buettner travels all over the globe in search of the places where people consistently live longer, healthier lives. They are called Blue Zones, cities and villages where people live to be 100 and beyond. That includes Loma Linda, California, Nicoya, Costa Rica, Sardinia, Italy, Icaria, Greece, and Okinawa, Japan. So why are they living longer? Buettner and fellow researchers say it's because of plant-based diets, moderate activity, good company, and even red wine. His new cookbook, The Blue Zones American Kitchen, introduces 100 new recipes that he says could add 10 years to your life. So we went to a restaurant that follows his principles to learn how we too can live to be 100.
Dan, it's so nice to meet you.
Nicer to meet you.
What got you interested in the Blue Zones?
I've been a writer for National Geographic for about 20 years, and my specialty has been solving ancient mysteries. And in 1999, the World Health Organization came out with a finding that showed that Okinawa, Japan, had the longest disability-free life expectancy in the world. So in other words, people live the longest, but they didn't get diabetes and heart disease and suffer from obesity. And I said, aha, that's a good mystery.
So you wanted to say, what is the secret to their longevity?
Yes.
And what did you find?
There's no silver bullet. There's no pill or supplement or magical diet, but it's a cluster of mutually supporting things that keep people doing the right things and avoiding the wrong things so that they don't develop a chronic disease. So they're not dying early deaths like many of us in America are.
And in this, while you uncovered what was going on in Okinawa, you found that there were other blue zones around the world, right?
We found the longest lived men in the world in the highlands of Sardinia, the Nuoro province, the island of Icaria, which is very close to Turkey, a population that lives about 8 years longer, but without dementia. In Nicoya, Costa Rica, population who lives to age 90 at rates about 2 or 3 times greater than the United States, spending 1/15 the amount we do on healthcare. In the United States, among the Seventh-day Adventists, conservative Christians that live very close to Los Angeles, we found a population that's living about 8 to 10 years longer than their California neighbors.
So even though all these blue zones are all around the world, these groups of people that are living into their hundreds, they have similar habits, right?
Yes, it's remarkable. The same 9 things, I call it the Power 9, but they're eating mostly a whole food, plant-based diet. The pillars of every longevity diet in the world are whole grains, greens, nuts, tubers like sweet potatoes, and beans. A cup of beans seems to add about 4 extra years of life expectancy if you can eat it every day. But the reason that they're living a long time is because they have social circles around them that help reinforce the right eating. They live in places where the healthy choice is the easy choice, so they're not bombarded by junk food advertising, et cetera. They have strong social networks, and this is really important. They also have vocabulary for purpose. And we know that people who wake up with a direction in life are living about 8 years longer than people who are rudderless. So it's not the pharmaceutical, anti-aging industry approach to longevity. It's longevity as lived by real people from around the world.
In other words, their life is full of naturally healthy choices. They don't necessarily go to the gym more than anybody else. They're just walking everywhere, right?
Yeah, every time they go to work or a friend's house or out to eat, it occasions a walk. They're doing housework and yard work by hand. They tend to have gardens out back. So my team figures they're moving naturally every 20 minutes or so. So when you add up the caloric spend throughout the day, it's way more than if they worked all day and then went to the gym. And along the way, they're keeping their metabolism at a higher level, so they're burning fat without thinking about it.
What about meat?
They do eat meat, but surprisingly little. Meat about 5 times per month. And we know that because we've done a worldwide average of these dietary studies in all blue zones over the last 100 years. So meat is kind of a celebratory food. Very little fish, very little cheese, but it's mostly peasant food, Norah. Cheap food anybody can afford. And the secret, of course, is combining it in a way where it tastes, I like to call maniacally delicious. And that's what keeps people doing it for long enough that it makes a difference.
I was surprised about the fish thing, I have to tell you.
Well, if you look at the blue zones, even though there are a couple islands, they live inland. And to go get fish, it would require them to travel for a day, spend a day at sea and get the fish back up. So it was much easier for them to get their calories from their gardens.
You also have talked about in your books about carbohydrates. I think carbohydrates have gotten a negative label on them, but there's certain types of carbohydrates that we should be eating, correct?
The word carbohydrate is the worst word in the nutritional vocabulary because on one hand, you have cookies and candy bars and sodas, and those are simple carbohydrates and arguably the most toxic ingredients in our diet. But at the other end of the extreme, you have beans and nuts and grains, and those are the most healthy. And we know if you take worldwide and you average out what these people have been eating over the last 100 years, 2/3 of their calories come from complex carbohydrates. That is the number one foodstuff for longevity.
How many nuts a day are we supposed to be eating?
One handful of nuts is worth about 2 years of life expectancy.
What about alcohol?
Well, of course, I'm familiar with the research suggesting that no level of alcohol is safe, but I can tell you from Blue Zone, these people are enjoying a little bit of red wine every day, and they're still making it into their 90s and 100s and cognitively sharp. So I believe there's a place for it in moderation in our diet.
I read that you had interviewed 350 centenarians, and there is one thing that they don't drink: soda.
Soda, yes. Soda pop is unknown to most Blue Zone centenarians. Yeah, we get most of our refined sugars from sugar-sweetened beverages. And if I were to pick one thing to take out of the American diet that would most improve our health, it would be soda pops.
So if people are looking to live longer, what are some of the simple steps that they can take in order to achieve that goal?
Diets don't work. Fewer than 2% of any diets work for more than 2 years. But if you sit down with a plant-based cookbook with your family, identify a dozen recipes that you think your family would enjoy, and instead of going on a diet or spending a bunch of money on a program, just cook those foods. And as soon as you find a half a dozen recipes that you know how to cook, your family likes, and you think taste delicious, my job is done. I calculate that the average American could live about 6 extra years if they went from a standard American diet to a plant-based diet. Biggest gift you could give to your family. Number 2, pay careful attention to your immediate social circle. We know that if your 3 best friends are overweight and unhealthy, your chances of being overweight go up by about 150%. And number 3, at least one of them should be a vegetarian or a vegan because they're going to show you how to find and make delicious plant-based food. And at the end of the day, it's the deliciousness that is the most important ingredient in any longevity recipe.
And when we come back, we're going to talk to Dan Buettner about his new cookbook and whether he's found more blue zones across the world. It's so interesting because as you studied all of these people who reach 100, live very long lives, you've also found that they're living good lives, right? That the level of disease is also at much lower levels than perhaps we're used to here in the United States. What do you attribute that to?
It turns out the same things that get you to a healthy age 90 or 100 are the things that make us happy. And in these blue zones, they're among the top quintile, or the top 20% of the happiest places in the world. And it turns out that having a sense of purpose, having a good social network, having health, these are the main drivers of happiness, and they're the drivers that will get you to age 100.
What about cancers?
Okinawa, for example, about 1/5 the rate of breast and prostate cancers. Blue zones do particularly well when it comes to the cancers that begin in your mouth and finish at the other end, the GI tract. Those are the cancers that are particularly susceptible or sensitive to lots of meat, lots of cheese, lots of sugar.
How many people do you meet that don't know any of this, that you find like you're uncovering a truth for them for the first time in their lives? I mean, how disconnected have we become from what is healthy eating?
I'd say 1 in 5 people know the blue zones and understand the way of eating. It's very hard to cut through the noise. But my pitch is simple. These are real human beings who've been around for hundreds or thousands of years, and this is the way they eat, and we know they're making it to ages 90 and 100 without disease. Why not follow them?
In your new book, it's called The Blue Zone's American Kitchen. You traveled around this country to find the areas where people naturally or culturally cook healthy. And you really uncovered some really interesting stuff.
I found these dietary surveys done not just among European immigrants, but in Black, Asian, Latin American, Native Americans. And I was looking for the dietary pattern we found in blue zones. And lo and behold, these under-celebrated ethnicities were eating almost exactly a blue zone diet. So then we traveled from Maine to Miami to Maui up to Minnesota, and we found historian chefs who could bring this consummately standard American, alternate standard American diet to life.
The traditional African American cuisine.
Yeah, I mean, we tend to think of soul food as really junky and unhealthy, but if you go back 100 years, African Americans were making things like Hoppin' John, which are beans and rice. Remember, that's a whole protein with collard greens, arguably the healthiest. They weren't rich people, but they were amazingly inventive. The Gullah Geechee took their West African tradition, fused it with Native Americans when they came over here, and their enslavers. The first gumbos, in fact, were brought over by African Americans, not New Orleans. And they were mostly plant-based because that's what they could afford. But they were just brilliant combinations of food.
What about Native American cuisine?
Yeah, so Native Americans, they really brought us this Three Sisters diet, which is beans, squash, and corn. Probably what was a real Thanksgiving dinner circa 1620. And probably instead of a turkey at that table, there was a pot of succotash, which is corn, beans, greens, and squash. And yes, they're really the first progenitors of the American diet.
And what about Asian American cuisine?
Asians, the immigrants came over here, and they were particularly good at identifying greens. I would say that the healthiest food overall, with the most nutritional packed, and even protein. There's more protein ounce for ounce in spinach than there is in beef. The Asians were really good at identifying 70 or 80 kinds of greens. And they knew how to take this symphony of flavors, these curries and these spices and these umami flavors, and bring them together. And then when they got here, they took their American influences. And I think the most inventive cuisine in America is actually in Hawaii, where you have the Filipinos, the Chinese, the Portuguese, and the Japanese, and the native Hawaiian. And it's just this explosion of culinary genius that we kind of miss when we go down there and eat fast food.
So if you had 3 top tips for someone who said, look, I want to live longer and I want to live healthier, incorporate what into my diet?
I think the first thing is to eat a big breakfast, ideally savory breakfast. Number 2, learn how to incorporate beans in the foods you like, because beans are a great protein substitute for unhealthier. Snack on nuts, and quit eating by, we say eat breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper. Quit eating by 5 or 6 o'clock at night. You do your body a favor.
Are there any emerging blue zones?
There is, but I can't tell you about it yet. I'll be making a big announcement in June.
Really?
Yes, we've been working on it for 3 years, but yeah, it's a big announcement. It's a 2.0.
This is an undiscovered area where there's a group of people who are living into their hundreds?
They're living the longest, healthiest lives in the world. That's all I can say.
Wow.
I will also say, though, but over the last 12 years, we've been manufacturing blue zones in cities like Fort Worth, Texas, where they have adopted this approach of not trying to change a million people's minds, but changing their environment so the healthy choice is the easy choice. In the course of 5 years, we lowered the obesity rate of Fort Worth, Texas by about 3%, whereas the rest of Texas, they got heavier. And that was confirmed by Gallup. And Gallup further calculates that we help save their city about $250 million a year in unnecessary health costs.
And who put that group together to do that?
I did. Yes, we had a team of over 100 people, full-time employees, and it takes the DNA from places like Okinawa and Sardinia and puts it to work here in America. So the good news is, I doubt these blue zones will be around forever, but the blueprint, we now have the blueprint. We know exactly what Americans and American cities can be doing if we want to reverse this, this unhealthy trend we have in America. We're spending about $4.2 trillion a year on healthcare costs, and about 80% of that comes from largely avoidable diseases. So, we're really headed for trouble unless we start to make some serious changes.
And when we come back, we'll cook a Blue Zones meal. Wow, look what we have here. Rich Landau is the chef owner at the Fancy Radish, a plant-based restaurant in Washington, D.C., and he's featured in Buettner's new book. So this is what we eat to live longer.
According to this man, yes.
Well, okay, so here's all the pillar foods. You have sweet potatoes, our tubered beans, the cornerstone of every longevity diet, our nuts, a handful a day. Sourdough bread, the Sardinians, much lower glycemic load than regular bread. But the most important ingredient is taste. And that's where Rich comes in, because I would argue he is the best in America when it comes, and he's been doing it for a quarter of a century, taking plant foods and making it taste better than meat.
You mentioned Hoppin' John, and I think that is a great dish. This is basically, like you described, Dan, it's a kind of a one-pot dish, rice and beans, collards. Now, they do put some meat in it. Now, we're not going to do that because we are a vegan restaurant, plant-based. What we're going to do instead is take some of these smoked shiitake mushrooms. And they're chewy and they're smoky, and they can give you some of that satisfaction that you're giving up when you do cut out the meat. So let's start off with some veggies here. Onions and celeries into the pan. As so many great dishes are, they are rooted in so much tradition.
Is that green pepper?
That's jalapeno.
Oh, jalapeno. Okay.
It's a little bit of spice and some garlic, of course, and we're sautéing in olive oil here. Now, what we want to do now is get our first layer of seasoning in there. We season in foundation to begin with, and then we season at the end for that first taste that hits your palate.
So salt, pepper.
Salt and pepper, real simple. We're going to do a little bit of cayenne here, and a little bit of chipotle. This is not a traditional ingredient here. This is more of a Southwest ingredient, but it gives us some of that smokiness. The chipotle is a smoked jalapeno. Again, in the foundation of the flavor, some of that smokiness. And a little bit of dried thyme. I'm not a huge fan of dried herbs, but some of them, if you use them early, are absolutely delicious. Okay, we're just going to get some color on these veggies real quick. A little bit more heat.
How much are spices? We didn't talk about spices in the blue zones.
In some blue zones, they're very important, like turmeric, which is anti-inflammatory. It's huge in the Okinawan. And greens, as Rich has here, rosemary, Icaria, and Sardinia. This is used as a tea and a medicine. It's anti-inflammatory, and it's a mild diuretic, so it helps lower your blood pressure.
Throw it in there, chef.
There we go.
There you go.
I'll be your sous chef.
You sold me. That sounds
Did you
amazing.
like the way I threw it in there?
Let's try it. Bay leaf. Let's try some bay leaf. Now, what we're going to do with these are very bright green. We're not going to leave them in there the whole time because then they'll turn brown. And once, you can smell it already, the rosemary. We're just going to take them out. Let them give us a little bit of flavor in the beginning here.
Oh, that's interesting.
Now, I know you love collards, Dan. These have been blanched, meaning we've put them into salt water, boiling salt water.
These are collard greens right here.
Collard greens
That's
right
kale.
there.
Yeah.
And they are delicious. They're meaty, and they're hearty, and they have so much flavor.
But I love you were telling me that instead of cooking them a long time when they become bitter,
Right.
by just cooking them a little bit till they're bright green, throwing them in an ice bath, they taste sweeter.
They absolutely taste sweeter, and they retain more of their nutrients.
I think that's what happened with Brussels sprouts, because growing up, everybody overcooked Brussels
Oh, yeah.
sprouts. Yeah,
And
right.
the water that came in the can.
and even
It's like a
broccoli.
punishment.
And now we find if you just put it, broccoli in the oven with a little olive oil and lemon and maybe a little garlic, it tastes delicious.
And we're going to let that simmer
Wow, that smells delicious.
and absorb. And I think, Dan, if you don't mind, I'm going to steal some of the chickpeas you brought, because those are really looking good right there. We'll go double down on these beans.
Lentils have lots of vitamins, proteins. They're just like the perfect
fiber,
food, right?
They really are.
Yeah.
By the way, this dish has as much protein as a dish that would have meat in it, but with none of the saturated fat, none of the pain.
There is Hoppin' John.
Wow,
What do
that
you
is
think?
so beautiful. Oh my gosh, stunning. It's fantastic. It's so good.
People like to have what they perceive as a protein as the middle of the dish, so it's easier for a meat eater to make the transition if you have some center stage, high protein.
Let's go put a tofu in it. All right, so this is what I mean. So this tofu has been baked, and then we marinate it with beet juice and mustard.
Beet juice.
Beet juice, so that takes that white color out of it. Kind of makes
Oh,
it
I
look
see.
like salmon a little bit.
Okay.
And then we have these glowing charcoal embers here, all that flavor going into the tofu. And there we go, look at that. Now all of a
That
sudden,
looks beautiful.
you've
Oh
got
my
that
gosh.
protein shot up there.
That looks so pretty. Amazing. Okay, should I take a bite?
Yeah.
Go for it, it's gonna be a little hot. So
Oh, okay.
just,
Beet juice. So how do you make beet juice?
just put it right in the blender.
Yeah.
A little mustard, a little bit of neutral oil
After you've baked it?
after we bake it. And
Yeah.
that white gives it that nice color.
Wow, that is delicious.
Isn't that nice?
Yeah,
Tofu
There
day.
yeah,
that's great.
tofu baptism right here.
Well, thank you. Absolutely delicious. So good. Is it expensive to eat like this?
No, not at all. I mean, it's essentially rice and beans. Shiitake mushrooms are not expensive, and tofu, honestly, you can't do better. Bang for the buck for tofu.
All right, I'm gonna eat more vegetarian. I'm not
Yes.
gonna give it up. I'm not gonna give up the meat. But this is delicious.
Well, I think that, all we ever want to do is like lead by example and show people that you can enjoy this.